Uh, okay. It's just starting, so just a second. All right, here we go.
Sure, sure.
Um,
I just got
uh,
an echo. I don't know if I'm gonna keep getting it.
oh, from me?
I'm not anymore, so I guess it's fine.
Okay. Oh, that might have just that usually happens when the recording starts on Skype for some reason, maybe. So that might be it. So,
Okay.
um, okay. Yeah. So just we're just gonna go over just like metaphysical stuff, like those philosophical ideas. I know I did a response to your nationalist stuff. I mean, I'd be happy to have another conversation about that. But I do. I mean, the bulk of the stuff I want to get into, I think the philosophy stuff is more interesting. So that's probably the main stuff today. And there's going to be a series of questions here. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them because they're going to take time to answer, I'd imagine. So whenever you want to stop, just let me know, and then yeah.
Sure,
Um,
sounds good.
all right, everybody. So today I'm here with Aarvoll, and I've been wanting to speak to him for a long time. And I have a series of questions regarding his, I guess you could say his uh, metaphysical system. A lot of these questions are going to be oriented towards series of videos that you did called "The Metaphysics of the Perennial Philosophy," um, which I believe was a couple you did a couple years ago. And to me, that seems really interesting. And I guess some of your other videos kind of also tap into that. So I guess yeah, I'll just start here. Um, so my first question for you would be, in the first video you did on the perennial philosophy, you spoke about how it isn't possible to imagine a limit to space. And my question here would be, would the reason for this be that in order for a limitation on space to occur, it would have to be another spatial determination? Uh, and if it was another spatial determination, you just end up with like an infinite regress of spatial determination. So therefore, space would just be infinite. Was that would that be your reasoning or?
Yeah, I can't say that that was the chain of reasoning in my mind, but it affects the same uh, result. I was really just appealing kind of phenomenologically that if when you imagine a limit on space, you are imagining like the null space on the other side of that, which is going to be another space in your mind. There's no way to like eliminate the concept of space from your mind. So when you say like space ends here, your mind doesn't respect that, and nevertheless, it fills in more space on the other side.
Right, I understand. Yeah, so here, like quote unquote, here is itself a sort of like spatial uh determination in a way. Um, so yeah, and then do you think that the concept of empty space might be flawed, as in space? Well, the reason why it could be flawed, I guess, is that space cannot contain quote unquote nothing because that which does not exist can't be contained. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there I would probably look to physics more than anything else, as far as, is a pure vacuum possible? It seems like it's not, and it depends on what theory of space you subscribe to. In loop quantum gravity, the fabric of space is kind of woven by a network of gravitons, which are the, elementary particle carrying the force of gravity. And so in that sense, like space can't be absolutely empty. For space to exist, like some kind of force, namely gravity, has to be present. I don't know of any theory of space which allows for physical space without, some kind of energy or matter in it. Obviously, you can't define a space without objects. Like, in Euclidean geometry, you don't have space when you just have the point. Like the first space is defined, um, I mean, arguably with the first plane, So yeah, I think purely empty space again is something that's inconceivable.
Right. I mean, it would be almost impossible, I guess, to form any predication if something is empty, right? Uh, I don't think that would work.
Well, what you have to do then is like say that the logic of space or like the set of dimensional distinctions that characterize space is just prior to whatever is in space entirely. And while, I mean, it's possible that it could work that way, um, it it doesn't have the advantage of like defining the nature of space integrally. Like space is this kind of prior concept that's prior to experience, prior to anything else, that's empirically accessible. And then the empirical contents just kind of fill into that already established thing. But if you do that, then the only way to define space and its attributes is purely metaphysically. And I don't think space is really the right, like, you shouldn't be treating space metaphysically. Space is a physical property. You should be treating it physically. And so, like, the loop quantum gravity approach, or like also, what's this guy's name? Wolfram, Stephen Wolfram, his theory of everything that he's developing based on a kind of computational reductionism, also in a similar way, like derives space and its properties from networks of like elementary kind of logical operators. It's pretty similar to loop quantum gravity and what they're trying to do. But yeah, if you want space to have these properties before any content, then space is metaphysical. And then, like, why does it have precisely those properties which it has? And there's, no way to really answer that. Kant sort of does that, but for Kant, he's describing like space as a mental category, and obviously treats like whatever noumenal space would be, or physical space, or the real, he treats agnostically. So yeah, the best you could get to in that regard is kind of Kantian uh, aesthetic.
Right. Okay. And so I saw in that first video you did on the perennial philosophy, you took issue with the concept um, of the way the infinite is described by many, and that, like one often posits the infinite in a limited context, so to speak. So, for example, you stated that in a number line, you could have a quote unquote well, an infinite set of numbers, or yeah, but you couldn't have like a pig or something. Um,
Yeah.
and this is interesting because one of my favorite books by this author, Rene Guénon, in his work, The Metaphysical Principles of the Infinitesimal Calculus, he actually, I think in like the first chapter, he points out uh, that we're better off calling this the indefinite and not the infinite, because the fact that, well, this is a number line to begin with, kind of presupposes a sort of determination, I guess a qualitative determination,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess also quantitative as well, because we're talking about number. Um, do you think like this would be a good like distinct like a good like hermeneutic, or in a way to distinguish between the indefinite and the infinite, just like in a contextual way, or what are your thoughts on that?
Uh, yeah, I have no objection to that in particular. I don't think that a pure infinity is conceivable either. Like Proclus will say in multiple places that you can't have infinites taken infinitely. You can have limited infinites, like with numbers or with powers of certain gods or whatever, but you never have like an undefined infinite. It's always defined, it's always delimited by certain parameters. Otherwise, like, what exactly are you conceiving? And then, like, you can kind of point to the asymptote of that, concept that's not a concept of the pure infinite. And that would be something like the indefinite dyad in Platonism, Pythagoreanism, or chaos in like that way of conceiving of like metaphysical ultimates. You have like the undifferentiated, which is not the infinite in the sense of like having unlimited energies, being able to do infinite things. Like the idea of the undifferentiated or the simple, Brahman or reality in itself is more to the side of stasis. Of course, no cataphatic direct predication is appropriate to it ultimately, and all of the major perennialist schools agree on that. Um, so to say that the one is purely static is wrong. To say that it's dynamic is wrong. There's no like direct statement we can make about it that's going to be unqualifiedly true. But then after that, the two aspects that first come to mind in most systems are order, chaos, um, yin, or actually yang and yin, respectively. So that first feminine principle yin or the indefinite dyad is most like what we would think of as an archetype of infinity. But even then, it's posterior to limit in some respect. And like there is really no, because when you say like the infinite in the most absolute sense, that itself is self contradictory because to say that it is A is to say it fits within the limits of concept A. So a pure infinity is inconceivable. In some respect, you could say that the one is infinite, right? In a certain respect, and then it does not have limits. But in another respect, it the source of limitation and is its own kind of limit. Um, but yeah, I mean, at that level, we're not going to be able to use any premise or a proposition syllogistically, deductively. We can't really prove things at that level of apophatic and analogical reasoning. So the first level where um, infinites become calculable will be like infinites in very limited senses, right? Where it's limited in basically all respects except one. And that's why Proclus says, like, for the purposes of philosophy, you can't take infinites infinitely. You can only take infinites in a certain respect within certain parameters.
Now, when you say take, do you just mean like conceive or predicate? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. Yeah, and yeah, that would make sense. And I guess like like the one thing that would kind of be what's the word I'm looking for here? The one thing that would be kind of the quality that would be shared amongst these sets of infinites would have to be, I guess, continuity in some sense in order for us to make that predication. I think that's sort of,
yeah.
I mean, yeah. Do you agree with
Well,
that?
continuity, not necessarily because the set of integers is discontinuous and yet infinite.
Right. Okay. I guess that makes sense. So I guess there'd have to be something regarding um I don't know. Yeah, I guess not necessarily the numerical continuity, but it would have to be some sort of common essence between the sets of infinites to call them infinite. I mean, but I guess I don't know what exactly that would be.
Right. Well, at one level, the thing held in common will be participation in the indefinite dyad. So like anything that can be described as infinite, except for the one itself, is going to ultimately derive that character of infinity from the indefinite dyad. And I think that's also equated with the principle of matter by Iamblichus. Prime matter is that principle of unlimitedness. And it's similar to continuity. So I think you're on the right track in a sense where like matter is what fills in the form without exception. It like given some system of limitations, it fills in all the possible energies that will work with that essence.
Right. Okay. And um, speaking of prime matter, I mean, do you think the idea? Because I've heard some describe, and this kind of seems paradoxical. Like Guénon, I'm going to reference him again. He speaks of prima materia as a sort of pure potentiality, but while at the same time being pure quantity. And I
Mm-hmm.
think uh, on the face that sounds fine, but I think there could be sort of like a contradiction in the sense that if it's a pure quantity and a pure potentiality, well, how can you reconcile that? Like if something's a quantity, that already kind of presupposes another determination. But maybe it falls back into the issue of, well, you can't really say anything about it. But again, I mean, he would still be, you know what I mean,
Yeah,
predicating.
yeah. I think quantity is quite a bit lower down on the chain than the principle of uh, matter in that sense that we were just talking about it. Like he might be identifying another thing as prime matter, but for Iamblichus, for Proclus, that kind of prime matter will be above all beings entirely, and quantity doesn't appear until quite a bit after the realm of beings. Like the late Neoplatonists try to integrate Aristotle and Plato. So when they're interpreting Aristotle's texts, they always kind of try to point how he was like secretly veiling Platonic doctrines. And in the categories, the very first category, of course, is substance. The other nine categories he mentions are types of accident, which means they're dependent on substance. So substance is metaphysically prior to the other categories. The second category is quantity, followed by quality. So quantity is an accident of substance, and the Greek term substance there is ousia, which is just kind of being also. In Aristotle, translators often use the term substance as opposed to being, whereas in Plato, same word, they use the term being more often, which is kind of strange. But anyway, being is the second hypostasis. So the first hypostasis is the one, the monad, the principle of limitation, and the indefinite dyad, and then Proclus throws in henads there, which are like aspects of unity, which have different admixtures of limit and unlimitation, but they're prior to essence. After the first hypostasis, they're also the gods in a sense. The second hypostasis is like the realm of forms, strictly speaking, and there you have it's kind of kicked off with being. That is also by Iamblichus and a couple others called number itself, but that will be a super quantitative number, dealing with archetypal number rather than mathematical quantity. So the first place where mathematical objects appear is in the third hypostasis, so after the realm of forms entirely, between the realm of forms and the realm of souls. In another sense, it's like at the same level. Iamblichus does say mathematicals are at the same level as souls, and basically like souls are essentially mathematical. So you wouldn't get quantity until you get soul to differentiate mathematical quantity. All other mathematical properties are at the level of soul strictly, or like in their first instantiation. Nevertheless, there's archetypal number above that level. It just depends on what sense of quantity you're talking about. But I don't think I can't think of a way to reconcile what Guinan is saying if he says that prime matter is pure quantity. To say that it's pure energy is close, or but not really pure potency, because act is prior to potency, even for
Right.
Aristotle. Like he'll say it's act is metaphysically prior, although in the corporeal world, obviously, like potentials in a sense precede actuals. But yeah, since act is first, then the only place for act before prime matter, if Guanan was right, would be in the monad, and that's not quite right either, because the monad is more like the archetype of essence than the archetype of energy. So I think the probably the right way to look at it is the limiting principle at the highest level, the masculine principle, is the archetype of limitation. The feminine is, you could say, archetype of unlimitation, or you could say the archetype of power, uh, matter and power being related there, but power subsumes the two concepts, act and potency, energeia, and I forget the Greek term for potency. The Greek term for power will be dunamis, by the way. But anyway, so I don't know how Guinan is conceiving of that. I haven't read a ton of Guinan. I read it a little bit, but it's not
Yeah.
my favorite.
So in this, what you described here, so power would you would say that that would underlie those categories of potency and actuality? Is that correct? Or
Yeah, yeah.
oh,
Power is like the genus of both act and potency.
okay, okay. So is it an actual um, metaphysical category, or is it just like an epistemological way, like, or is it both? Would you say, like, is it just yeah? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's posited as a metaphysical category, and I would equate it with, or equate its archetype with the indefinite dyad. That would be the
Oh,
first power.
okay. And then moving on here, so in regards to monism and dualism, what are your thoughts on the idea that there is an option between these two, which is that unity and multiplicity metaphysically presuppose one another, uh, that in order for multiplicity to exist as such, it would require a unity to unify all objects under some category, and that for unity to exist, it must be a unity of something. So it therefore requires a multiplicity of something to exist, so that it can even have the opportunity to have the role or essence that it has, which is the ultimate unity.
For a unified thing to exist, there has to be a multitude to unify, but a pure unity, I don't think conceptually depends on any multiplicity. Like if you take away all qualities, all predicates in your mind until you're left with like what's indistinguishable from nothing, the kind of apophatic reduction, theologically speaking, then I don't know that that necessarily entails multiplicity. Also, like the logical idea of unity doesn't necessitate multiplicity. A unified thing does, but not unity itself, in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah, and I think this is like a big like well, I don't know if it's a big debate, but it is a debate between like Orthodox Christians and theologians or I'm sorry, and Neoplatonists, I think. Um
Mm-hmm.
they often speak about like, oh, we don't put any primacy when I say they, I mean the Orthodox. We don't put any primacy on unity as opposed to multiplicity. They kind of have like this what is it, like they're equal to one another in terms of like ontological status, I guess.
I think that the Orthodox position is that there is a preeminence of the one over the many in God,
I
although
I see.
both are fundamental.
I see. Okay. So both are fundamental, but one just has a more uh in terms of logical order, one is ordered in a way, I guess you could say, what one is multiplicity is still subordinate to unity, but both are still fundamental in the grand scheme of things. Is that
Right. That so like, the Son is not created. He's uncreated and eternal, and yet the Son prays to the Father, not vice versa.
right? Exactly. Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense then. Um, so I wanted to get your opinion on this idea. Um, I know you just said you haven't read much going on, so if you don't know this, that's fine. We can skip over it. Basically, this idea posited by him, which regarding the notion of the number zero, and I've been having a debate with people about this for months now, uh, and I agree with him. But basically, he rejects the notion as it is posited currently by mathematics because he takes issue with applying concrete predication to that which can't be predicated, namely quote unquote nothing. Zero can't really work as a concept for the same reason that the concept of nothing can't either. So, would you agree that if this is the case, that zero would be like an invalid or kind of a flawed concept, couldn't and couldn't be used in operations, that is mathematical operations, if the current concept we have is still held. So, restoring it like or leaving it. Some people will try and say, let's make this. It's just a symbol, right? And I think resorting to calling it just a symbol seems also a little silly because the essence of a symbol seems to be pointing to something, which is another thing. And if zero is not a thing, then what was that symbol pointing to? So, what is your take on that?
Hmm. Yeah. The idea of pure nothingness does not work, and yet there is a no thingness to the absolute.
Hmm.
So that there's an aspect of I've thought about before, like how zero taken in one sense leads to just like an absolute negation. But if it's used as a denominator, if you measure by zero, then well, technically you get an undefined, but it stands at the asymptote of infinity, right? So if you take smaller and
Hmm.
smaller denominators, you approach infinity. Zero should be infinity. So that I think it does have symbolic value, and it stands as a limit that can't actually be attained mathematically, of course, but like we there is utility, I think, in having a name for that. I think of like, for example, Proclus's concept of evil, where evil is always named homonymously or equivocally, as in it is not one um, universal property that instantiates in different places. There is no arche of evil. Each particular evil is contrary to some particular good. So in that sense, he refutes the idea, like given by Plotinus, that like the contrary of the good is evil. So in opposition to the one, you might say you need the zero. In opposition to pure being, you need pure nothing. And Proclus denies that, saying there is no archetype of evil and there is no pure nothing either. Um, so that's why I go to this evil example. I don't know where in the literature any Neoplatonist addresses the concept of pure nothingness. But yeah, I think we can learn from the example of evil. So each particular evil is not even a contrary because it's only opposite to particular natures, not universal natures. So it's actually technically a subcontrary and not a evil isn't contrary to anything. There are a multitude of evils, but no one archetype of evil because it's termed homonymously, not synonymously. Um, so, but yeah, so I think you can have the negation of particular quantities, and mathematically it would be useful to have a symbol for that particular negation, and like that it's operable, or
Hmm.
it's operational. I mean, you can use it, but as like, is it itself a quantity? Probably not. I mean, if you think of like Cartesian uh, coordinate graph systems and the nature of the origin there, and then think of like how in relativity or whatnot, the reference frame is always defined against one of those origins, even in like Galilean relativity. I think that's the case. So if we are the origin and Atman is Brahman, there the zero isn't quantitative because like Atman doesn't have qualities. It
Hmm.
projects the qualities. So in the field of representation, in everything that surrounds the origin, that would be like the realm of quantity. But zero as like a negation of all of those qualities doesn't result in a quantity which is zero. It would result only in like that kind of symbol for the absolute. So there's, yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
exactly to think about it.
I um I agree with that. Like I don't have a problem of using it as a sort of symbol for negation of other quantities because I think in that sense because it would then be a relational symbol relating to something that has existence and is
Mm-hmm.
transitioning into another form of existence, right? And to me, that doesn't necessarily uh, that doesn't seem contradictory to me. If it's just symbolizing, one thing going to transforming into another thing, that's fine. But yeah, just the idea of a pure zero seems problematic in the way that it's defined. Also, speaking of going on here, he actually does take like he reinterprets the meaning of that symbol of zero. Basically, he says that if we imagine a number line, if we have positive and negative numbers in the positive root of numbers, we would stick with the normal infinity sign. Now, for the zero, instead of understanding it as the complete negation of all quantity, we would just understand it as a symbol of indefinite decrease as opposed to indefinite increase. So you can still have it like an indefinite multitude of decreasing quantities without actually without them being completely sublated. So I think that's fine. Um, so I think if we just kind of reinterpreted the meaning of this symbol, like I don't necessarily know exactly how I think it had to take a lot of rigor to do that, but just kind of speculating, I think you could reinterpret the meaning of that symbol. But then like my other problem would be is like, well, then what would zero mean in like the number 100? What would those two zeros mean in that case? Uh, like, would it just mean something else? Well, then if that's the case, you'd have to really understand like that. Then the meaning of that symbol would be uh, kind of multiple in the way you could understand it. So I think it is kind of a difficult issue to kind of figure out when it comes to how to use that symbol. But yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean, there it's a obviously a placeholder. The convention is like you have uh, the different digits represent different powers,
right.
essentially. So you powers of tens, powers of etc. And if there's no uh, nothing addition, like so you have 100, right? You have one power at the level of 100 and then nothing in addition to that. So you don't have any other numbers. So it's a placeholder,
Hmm.
but like it symbolizes obviously the power of tens and the power of ones in those respective places. It's just that those powers are not active in that
Yeah,
number, I guess.
yeah. And I again, like I being a placeholder, that's fine. With me, it was just you'd also have to say, well, a placeholder can't be a placeholder and nothing. If that's accepted, then I have no problem with it personally. And then, so yeah, okay, we'll move on to another question here. So regarding order and chaos, now do you see order as more fundamental or chaos? I wasn't so sure on your position on this. Yeah, that's pretty much a straightforward question.
Yeah. Well, I left it ambiguous, but I do believe order has to be prior to chaos because of the issue that chaos is an identity, and
Right,
identity falls under the category of order. So
right.
you can kind of conceive of pure order without chaos. It's impossible to conceive of chaos without order.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. That makes sense. That was my position as well. And um, following on from that, you call yourself a Christian perennialist, correct?
Yeah. Hmm.
And um, how does this differ from other forms of Christianity? In your is your like a you have a specific your own system, or do you subscribe to a system developed by other people? Could you go into that?
No, I mean, primarily I treat theory just philosophically, kind of in a way Socratically. The it's a hypothetical deductive system, and also there is that whole, holism of established theories that cohere together and work. So my system has changed, and I've gone for different moves, and I don't claim to have like the one definitive system, although generally I would claim to be closer than most people that I have dealt with to the truth of it. But yeah, as far as like how my perennialist metaphysics influences my views of Christianity, I think I'm probably not too far off from Origin from what I've read of him.
Mhm.
I don't have any of his texts, and it's hard to find them. I'm sure I could like on LibGen or something, but I've yet to read Origin. I also haven't read Scotus Origina, and I think that his system is likely pretty close to what I would go for. Um, but yeah, I if in a way, my kind of perennialist Christianity is very close to Thomism insofar as Thomas Aquinas was very close to Neoplatonism. And I think like the where Thomism runs into limitations is how to as Jay Dyer like correctly points out, how to reconcile divine simplicity with particular interactions of divinity in the mundane world. Because if you take divine simplicity to the extreme and like to a perennialist extreme, for to make contact with God at all is to receive the whole of God, because God can't have a surface if he's divinely simple, right? Like one part of him is the whole of him. And so the only logical option there would be a kind of perennialist interpretation where like what we're actually talking about is like the activation of a divine energy, the source of which is inside yourself wholly already. So then Atman is Brahman, God is within. And that does seem to be the way that Thomas Aquinas went at the end of his life when he became more mystical and kind of denounced his system building. And like someone knocked on the door, and famously he said, like, there is only God here, or something like that. So, and other Catholic mystics, Meister Eckhart, have come to similar conclusions. So, in a way, I'm very close to an almost traditional Catholic position, but I don't think you can marry all of the various historical doctrines and points of the Catholic Church um, with this Thomistic metaphysical system. I think the Thomistic system leads to a perennialist conclusion and a perennialist Christology and anthropology.
Okay.
But yeah, but in another respect, I'm kind of like a hyper Protestant in that I am not convinced at all about the historical consensus um, of the early church. I know that the documents are out there. I've read some of them, not all of them, but like when I read Eusebius or Irenaeus, these often don't seem to be men inspired with a Holy Spirit. They seem eristic and like mean-spirited and combative. It's kind of odd compared to Proclus, who like yes was anti-Christian, but like he keeps it extremely respectful. Not all Neoplatonists keep it respectful like that, but like Proclus reads like someone who actually had the Spirit. A lot of the early Christians don't read like somebody, like they often read as very prideful people. Augustine, in a certain respect, reads as someone who is very prideful, even in his confessions, where like it kind of reminds me of going to like small groups of Protestant Christians, and they have this tendency to, in a way, like humble brag about their sinful lives that they had prior to their conversions, and that's what Augustine like casually mentions. I had this problem with lust, and I slept with so many women. It's like, okay, Augustine, very yeah. It's not um, it's just, yeah, I just don't believe that early Christians had the Spirit. I do believe that a Spirit was conveyed in the first century, and that's undeniable. Like I think you know a tree by its fruits, and something happened. Like you can't explain it unless there's a historical basis to it. And I think in a perennialist interpretation, if Jesus was a historical Jew raised in likely Alexandria in Egypt, like that's where there was a large Jewish population. Philo of Alexandria was a Platonizing Jew, a Platonist, uh, in Alexandria when Jesus was a young boy. And then, like in the passage where they describe Jesus like returning with his parents, they lose him because he's off like arguing with the Pharisees. That maybe is because as a very young child, Jesus, who would be this kind of avatar figure, right, like unimpeded by a sin nature, kind of pure Atman, no Jiva type idea. Um, he would obviously be philosophically inclined. He would have had the intellectual resources at hand in Alexandria to make sense of Jewish theology in Platonist terms, and therefore in perennialist terms also. And like, yeah, preached the true message and was an embodiment of God, was an incarnation under the definition of an avatar from Hinduism. So I think that I can conjecture plausibly from perennialist principles and from the historical evidence that we have. But then what happened after in the codification and all the particular doctrines, I just simply don't buy it. So in a way, like I receive the gospel message. And what does it say in the Bible even? Like what is necessary for salvation? That you accept the gospel. God sent his only son, and only there doesn't necessarily mean a one and only historical manifestation, which is contradicted by even Protestants when they often say that Melchizedek was a Christophany. They're saying something very similar to the idea of the cycle of the avatars or whatever from Hinduism. Okay, so Jesus lived before then. If that's a Christophany, Melchizedek is a historical figure, not like a one-off apparition that gives Abraham his authority. So yeah, that even doesn't make entire sense for Protestants. But anyway, if you interpret like one and only Son to be the one perfect personality of Godhead instantiated in a human form, then okay, you're not contradicting Hinduism, you're not contradicting perennialist positions, and yeah, so if you accept that God sent His one and only Son to save the souls of men or whatever, it's extremely minimal, and accepting that I have no problem with. And yeah, I think that would be what's necessary for salvation. And anything beyond that, we can treat philosophically instead of having dogmatic Christology, dogmatic anthropology, dogmatic theology. Uh,
Hmm.
all of those should be under philosophy and should be treated with philosophical methods.
Right. I mean, I lean, towards being Christian more, but I understand where you're coming from. Like, I've had this problem with people, when I would, talk about, like, if there was something, like a theological issue, and they say, oh, well, this is a dogma. I'm like, yeah, I get that, but why? That's the question. It's a frustrating. There needs to be more dialogue as to, well, great that it's a dogma. That's fine by me. And I guess you kind of need. I think you need, in order to have a religion, you kind of need to have a set of dogmas, which is fine. But I think there also needs to be sound reasoning, which I think there is. But the people who posit them often don't engage in that kind of dialogue, which is a problem, in my opinion. Um, with that being said, you brought up the idea of Atman being Brahman, and I think there's a similar idea. When I was reading Wolfgang Smith's book, something about, I forget the name of the book, but it's one of his very well known books. I was reading it, and he posits this idea that, well, you can know God by looking within because you are made in the image of God. I mean, this is not his idea, obviously, but he's
Hmm.
espousing it. But You can know God by looking into yourself because you're made in the image of God. You are a reflection of the divine. Is that the same idea in the Hindu metaphysic?
Well, I mean, Hinduism doesn't have a unified metaphysics.
Right.
There's Advaita Vedanta, which I think is probably the most consistent interpretation of Upanishadic thought. Like when I read the Upanishads, it seemed like it was philosophically a monist position that was being articulated. And there, um, yeah, are we images of the divine, or does the summit of our being converge with the divine? That's the question. Obviously, as souls, we are images of the divine, but is our true being as soul or not? Proclus, I've looked at carefully here because he seems to indicate that we don't, for example, we don't have the forms themselves in us. We have images of the forms in us. And as souls, it is impossible to transcend into another type of essence. Like you will be what you essentially are for an infinite number of lifetimes. That seems to be implied or even directly stated by Proclus. Um, but the question is the true self um, our soul, or is it something beyond that? And Plato gets explicit enough to indicate that it's not the soul in all of its aspects. And Neoplatonists often say that like, the appetitive soul dissolves upon death. Even the thumatic soul dissolves. But the rational soul, which is like definitive of human nature, that carries on. But the rational soul is manifold as well, right? There's the lower discursive rational aspect, and then there's the higher intuitive intellectual aspects of the rational soul. And so is it, carrying on the same line of reasoning, is it the rational soul that we are essentially, and that has to continue indefinitely, or are we really the intuitive rational soul, which can energize in multiple discursive ways across different lifetimes? Um, or are we like the summit of the intellectual aspect of the rational soul? So is there like a henatic unity that we essentially are? And
Hmm.
then like take that back far enough, and do all beings ultimately converge at their essence? There's a statement by Plato in the first Alcibiades, which almost seems to intimate at that question, at least, like, are you really the rational soul? Or it's a phrase that is like, are you really that it's it itself, or something along those lines, which I think may be this reference to that idea. And that doctrine should be extremely esoteric. And I think that something like that, Joseph Campbell thinks this as well, by the way, was at the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries. Um, but it was meant to be a mystery doctrine and not something that was stated openly. So maybe when Proclus seems to indicate that our nature is an image of the divine, that does not exclude the possibility that our true being, like our truest self, at, at the at its zenith, is the divine itself.
Hmm.
And you would have to conclude that in a Thomistic system as well, if being is God, right? Like God is being itself and we are beings, then what is at our zenith? What is our summit as beings? Well, it's our genus, right? The generic nature precedes the specific. And I know that being won't be like a genus of beings in the Thomistic sense. You're gonna have to treat it, mystically, apophatically, etc., not synonymously. And that's the sense of like synonymous predication, is that a genus is predicated synonymously of its species and in the individuals, the species of its individuals, etc. So yeah, I lean towards the extreme view that we do converge on divinity itself, because if you say that there is the absolute division, that like we are, and any term that I'm going to use here is going to be problematic, but I want to say if we are essentially images of the divine, then the the metaphysical system becomes obviously far more complex, in that these real distinctions somehow allow for analogical relations between the first hypostasis, divinity, and particular beings. There we have a unity, and God is the one in a sense. We have our goodness, and God is goodness itself. But for them not to actually converge, I think that kind of requires explanation. Whereas the idea that, God is being and we are beings, and the summit of our particular being is the universal being that is there within us, substantiating our being, that would be, uh, yeah, all our zeniths, our hyparxes in the Greek terms, as I think they're used. Our hyparxis will be divinity itself. Um, and then in that way, all distinctions will be virtual rather than actual, and that simplifies the metaphysical picture quite a bit. Obviously, you don't have like an infinitude of things that need to be postulated as first principles, and if you have that, so that you could go for an ontological pluralism with a perspective like that, but it's just like massively complex, and I don't know why we should prefer that account to the actual monist account, the or non-dualist account, where distinctions are fundamentally virtual. Um, just because, like I said, kind of metaphysically, that seems more parsimonious, and it also like allows me to understand better the relation between like unity itself, the one itself, and unities or being itself and beings. Like it just seems to make more sense. Whereas if it is this image and there is like a creator creature distinction that is ultimate, how is that, how is that negotiated? How does that operate? What are the dynamics there? It seems like positing something like that requires a lot of additional explanation to make it work. Then the other option is that like so created things are not necessary, and they are the free acts of the one real being. But if that's the case, and then you have like God and what God creates arbitrarily, and all of those are images and like pertain to his nature in some sense but are distinct fundamentally from him, then it seems to be that you'll have to just accept the created world whatever it happens to be, just because,
Right.
not like why does it have the particular nature that it does? And I think that's that reason, wanting to preserve God's omniscience and his distinction from the world of things, is why you got nominalism. That's why William of Ockham preferred uh, something close to a nominalist position, because he wanted God to have that ultimate liberty. And yeah, I just don't. Yeah, I don't know. I think the most consistent way to go is Advaita Vedanta, a non-dualist way, and then the implication is that yeah, our the hyparxis of our soul, the summit of our soul, is divinity itself.
So when you speak of monism, and you just said before that distinctions are virtual. Now, because this gets a little tricky here, when you say virtual, do you mean um, illusory, non-existent, or do you mean that they exist in a specific context? Because I think that if you were to say they are completely illusory, then like how would you even be able to have an argument for monism? Because, for example, like wouldn't your argument not be distinguishable from arguments against monism? And like, you understand what I'm saying? Like it seems a little problematic if they are completely illusory, all distinctions that you couldn't really even argue for monism. That was my fundamental issue with it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've heard this objection before from Jay Dyer, and yeah, the idea that something is virtual does not mean that it's like it has no logic to it whatsoever.
Okay.
Um, it would be all, for this to work, the real being is divinity, and the virtual distinctions could only be kind of internal activities of that one divinity, right? So
Mhm.
they're particular acts of the divine nature, and the divine nature would be characterized by the set of all like metaphysically necessary truths. So, God would be, he would contain the forms, contain all logical principles in himself from eternity, ungenerated. And uh, I think, yeah, to get to that point, we could go into further arguments like, should God be above all that? That's basically the nominalist versus realist problem.
Right.
Does God is are the laws of logic in God, or does God create them? I think you can only say that they are in God, although when taken perfectly together, they amount to an absolute simplicity. But anyway, that you can't prove necessarily. You can only see like clues towards it. But assuming that the realist side of this is true, then virtual distinctions will be particular, like um, particular calculations along the
Mhm.
lines of God's already existing logical nature. So there will be reality to them, but they will just be delimited. And that also makes sense with the Pythagorean scheme where you have the one itself, and then the very first thing after that is limit. And what God would be doing is limiting himself to experience the particular solution to particular problems that he might pose to himself. In a way, it would be a way of like ensuring or guaranteeing omniscience, right? Because if God
Mhm.
just had all logical truth but didn't question himself and say like, well, do I really know that? How could God possibly question himself? And it's kind of weird because he's in like this solipsistic position, right? In
Right.
a way. So how could he possibly test it? Well, limit yourself in all possible ways and solve for the truth. Seek yourself. Seek the truth of yourself in literally every possible way to guarantee it. So these actions wouldn't be sequential in time. They would be eternal. They would be all together. I've used the analogy before of like quantum computing and classical computing.
Hmm.
With quantum computation, you are simultaneously looking at the most typical like thing that quantum computers calculate is factors of large numbers, right? So you will look at all the possible numbers that might be multiplied together to get to this large number, and then you find the solution and kind of collapse all the wave functions down to like the what you were ultimately looking for. But even the inventor of quantum computing, David Deutsch, says like quantum computing doesn't make sense. Like, how could it possibly operate unless all of the corresponding classical computations are being done in a distributed way between all of the various worlds in many worlds interpretation. So the power of quantum computing for Deutsch relies on that idea, but it also kind of means like you need each particular classical computation to actually happen, not as like the one actual and only calculation that is done, or like the one and only creation that God engages in to like, bring it back to what this is analogy for. Um, but you need the set of all of those actual classical computations and all of those actual finite experiences for God to create in his self-limitation in order for the whole kind of quantum computed solution to happen. So like for
Hmm.
God, his all of God's truths are held together in superposition, not spatially differentiated, not differentiated in no way. Actually, in the ultimate sense, not at the metaphysically ultimate level, but virtually what is going on within that wave function is all of the various particular um, delimiting acts. And that's also what it looks like in quantum theory, where you have the Schrodinger equation, which is kind of at rest. And somehow, and that's of the universe entirely, somehow that contains every combination of every particular quantum state of every object in the universe. So I think that's how it works. God is what is described in the Schrodinger equation, and all of his various energies, acts are particular experiences, and they're all virtual because none of them are metaphysically ultimate. And the limits that bind them are themselves ultimately going to be illusory in the sense that they're not ultimate. They can be taken back. Like any limit that God imposes can just be removed.
Right. And okay, so would it be accurate then to say that the world of immanence, the immanent world, the world we kind of inhabit, um, the distinctions here would be virtual, but patterned on the distinctions within God that are metaphysically, how should I put it? Have a real ontological status, but then at an even higher level, they kind of are not distinct. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there would be a hierarchy of distinctions. All distinctions would have to be virtual. All real
Okay.
distinctions, yeah. So none of them is metaphysically ultimate, which is just to say monism is true, right? The one is the first principle of things, and there aren't multiple first principles of things. Um, like if you, yeah, and yeah, you run into that problem. If you say there are multiple ultimate metaphysical principles, okay, that's kind of incoherent because to say that there are these multiple things is to say there is a common language syntax in which they're mutually intelligible. Like you can't have absolute disparate concepts held together in your mind. You are positing a higher, genus that subsumes these two things when you make a metaphysical supposition like that. So, and that's an argument that is given by Proclus in the Elements of Theology very convincingly, I think. So you need the only ultimate reality to be the one, and but then for all virtual realities to be suspended from him as his necessary energies, not accidental free will, whatever. I mean, it all expresses God's freedom in the sense that the one, if, the hyparxis of all beings converges on the one, then the one has the option of any, to go back to that analogy, any particular classical computation to find out any particular aspect of truth slash being slash himself. And so there is ultimate freedom. And yet, when you look at the set of everything, there is absolute necessity where
Right.
all possible paths are pursued. Um, but yeah, and there would be a hierarchy, as you say. Like there's the most primitive virtual distinctions that have to be supposed for any of the others to make sense, and that's you know uh, like an Aristotelian idea of what is prior and what's posterior. You can't imagine the posterior without the prior. The prior is entailed by the posterior, and so there are a bunch of virtual distinctions that are prior to anything that we see in the created world or the
Right.
generated world.
And you would say that because of the fact that they're not, like the virtual distinctions are not like completely invalid, obviously, they still have we can still use them in like to reason and have argumentation and point us to that higher, more fundamental reality. By point us to, I just simply
Right.
mean understand. Okay, okay, yeah, I could accept that. That makes sense. Um, Now, in another part of that series regarding the perennial philosophy, you talk about this idea, and this is the one idea I just can't wrap my head around, quite honestly. Um, and this is the idea of the largest being the smallest. Could you kind of expound on that? Like, what exactly do you mean here? I think it's related to interest web maybe.
Hmm. Uh, okay. So this is kind of my own particular way of thinking metaphysically before I really knew about Advaita Vedanta or Platonism in depth. Um, I kind of had my own way of thinking about these things, and that was a big part of it. So I'm sure I could find, you know, references in the Upanishads that would. In fact, I remember reading the Upanishads and thinking like, oh, this vindicates my my own special philosophy. But I haven't been looking at them lately, so I'll just give this from my own perspective. And basically, like the smallest unit of any system is going to have to be absolutely simple,
Hmm.
right? Because if there's any distinction within it, then it's not the smallest by definition. And the smallest, like you have to think also, it's not just what the part has in itself, but the part is defined by its relations to all the other parts. Like this is how Leibniz treats the monads, which are
Right.
like each of us are our own monads, but we contain somehow all the other monads. And one thing's identity entails the identity of everything else that it's related with. So you never have like completely isolated self-contained identities. One
Hmm.
identity implies the identity of all other things that it's related to. And ultimately everything's related to everything. So like, yeah, everything's connected type idea. But the smallest thing then for to have that absolute simplicity, it's um you're the only way to do that will be um will be to map onto the metaphysically ultimate absolute simplicity. So I'm going to try to make this uh, clear, but yeah, if you strip away all aspects, you get down to something like a bit in an information system, where it's just a basic distinction of presence or absence. But as long as you're talking about one bit among other bits, the notion of that bit, even though the bit as a part is simple, it's not absolutely simple because the notion, the Leibnizian notion of the bit, is complex because it involves all of the relations that it has to the other parts of the system. So that can't be the simplest thing in
Hmm.
any system. The simplest thing is going to reduce from all of those relations to something that is beyond relation and therefore again isomorphic to that kind of absolute
Right.
being. But another way to look at it is like the sense in which the smallest thing is complex is only ever true, according to my philosophy, from an outside vantage point. The where you get the real simplest being is from its internal vantage point. Because so for me, space, time, and relations are it's actually not. I don't agree with Leibniz that everything is related to everything else because I think there is a vanishing point where it's absolutely indefinite and indeterminate the status of your relation to a set of various things. So, for example, like outside the scope of the observable universe, in a many worlds ontology, what is beyond what cosmic structures are beyond that threshold? Well, maybe it's partly defined based on the structures we have here, but the same structure of the universe could be copy pasted into a variety of different kind of super cosmic or hypercosmic contexts, and it would be equally valid with everything experienced within the cosmos. So the context of a thing is indefinite at a certain level. We only define spatial relations, temporal relations, etc., based on our own capacity to register all of those things. Um, so if you have a very simple information system, you know, consider like a position on a chessboard. If we're going into like eidetic space, formal space of just chess positions, we're not talking about like the literal position on a literal board, but like the position itself. If that position itself has a subjectivity, and I don't think it does, but I do think many mathematical structures would, based on like integrated information theory as my preferred theory of consciousness at the moment, pioneered by Giulio Tononi and some co-authors. Um, so, but anyway, for the analogy of the chess position, a given position on the board does not entail all the past positions or obviously all the future positions. It does define a causal repertoire around itself. Like there is a certain number of positions that could have preceded this position, and there's a certain number of positions that could antecede it. So, I mean, I think that's exactly what we see in quantum mechanics, and it's most obvious in the future, obviously. We see a probability distribution of what may happen, and there's no way to reduce that as an epistemological problem. There is something ontologically real about the probability distribution. I don't want to necessarily go into all the arguments about that unless you want to, but
Hmm.
um, but I think the same would have to apply to the past, and actually I do think that that is vindicated in like delayed choice, double slit experiment type things, and also anyway, retrocausality in the context of quantum mechanics has been confirmed in a limited sense. So that you know, yeah, kind of reinforces what I'm saying about the context of things. The network of relations that a thing has is always defined by its own identity, its own capacity to register the differences. If like the different states of the context around a thing, the different states of its environment make no difference whatsoever internally to it, experientially to it, then it's not defined which context it's in. We're always in a superposition of contexts.
Right.
So in light of that, then go strip down to the smallest part of a thing, but take its internal perspective, and it's no longer a complex being. The bit of information viewed from the outside as this bit among many other bits, that's a complex thing, even though it's the simplest in one sense. But take its vantage point, and because it's only a bit, it's only an on. Everything is in superposition around it. And so
I
everything is the Schrodinger equation relative to it. So it's the
right.
one.
I got okay. So that makes sense. And yeah, and I like Leibniz. I like his idea of the monad. I guess, and you can kind of well, he does say, and I've only read it once, so I could be getting him wrong here. But from what I remember, he said something along the lines of, the monads are not affected, like they don't affect each other internally, but only in terms of relation because they're not composite entities. Um, Now, I think that's interesting. I think I could kind of see like how that might relate in the sense that uh like if I'm understanding you correctly, this bit of information from its own vantage point is kind of there's no distinction, right? But from outside of it, there would be a distinction because you're
Yes.
no longer in the simplest form of existence.
Right.
So okay, yeah, that makes sense. And moving on here, I was watching. This kind of go back. This is going to go back to what we were talking about before with God and distinction. I was watching your debate you had with Keith Woods. I think you guys were talking about like multiverse. This was a few months ago, like debating the multiverse stuff. And I think at one point you guys start talking about the idea of the good. And I think you hold the position. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. That the good exists outside of God. This is kind of isn't this similar to like the
No.
no, you don't. Okay,
The good is the one.
the good is the one. Okay. Um, And you would say the one is God? Because I know some people they seem to distinguish between like the one and God. Some it seems like some don't. I don't necessarily know what your position is on that.
Even Proclus would say that the one is the first God.
Okay. Okay. So then I guess would you say well from this then the one would have teleology then, right? If that's the case, and then the good would that's how the good would exist in a grounded sense?
Yeah. Um, well, if you just think of it like kind of psychologizing God in light of what I said about virtual distinctions and everything,
Hmm.
all acts are in service of his own omniscience and kind of substantiating his own being. So all acts, even that seem to diverge from him, ultimately are motivated, yet teleologically, by himself as that end. So he's the final cause of all things, as well as the first cause of all things.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And my last question here, and then this is not really a philosophical question. This is just uh, a question about the that Platonic Academy. I believe is the Platonic Academy that you wanted to kind of start, or is a sort of philosophical school. Could you tell us
Yeah.
like more like your idea behind that, how you kind of want to create that, how you came to that idea?
Yeah, well, that's a whole other uh, ballpark to discuss. But essentially, I do not have faith in the future of our civilization at a number of levels,
Hmm.
and they're in a hierarchy of needs kind of pattern. Like most essentially, I think like we're gonna have severe disruptions to our way of life in the not too distant future. And if you're not resilient and independent, you'll be dependent on the government and like the FEMA camp. I believe in all of that stuff. Like I followed it pretty in depth years and years ago when I was. Now I've basically come to the conclusion like this is what they're planning and this is what they will do to bring about this kind of great economic reset, new world order, whatever you want to call it. They're doing it, and if you're not independent, they yeah, you're just going to kind of I don't think you're gonna like life in the FEMA camps. I don't think you're gonna like the
Right.
future you have in store, and I don't think independence is realistically possible as individuals. Even if you have like quite a bit of wealth, like only communities will survive, and like if you consider like the extreme wealthy circles out there, like they even then, like a billionaire who has this massive estate effectively has a community himself. He has all the people working for him. Like no one can make it just with having a lot of wealth. Like only communities can be self-sufficient. Individuals in a limited sense can be, but not for their whole lives. And um, but anyway, yeah, we simply need communities. The kinds of community structures that we have are fragmented, and so most essentially, like human beings need communities, and our communities are broken, and it's part of a broader strategy to, like, yeah, deracinate us, reduce us to these atomized individuals, and make us completely dependent on a top-down system of control. So to avoid that, you have to have, there's no alternative but to be part of a literal physical community. Like networks of people you talk to online do not help here, cannot
Right.
help. Um, so yeah, you need communities, but I think without like an educational paradigm to unite a network of communities, they're like independent, isolated communities aren't in that much of a better position. Any meaningful, I don't even want to use the term like resistance, but any meaningful shot at having a hand in shaping the future of things requires a network of communities that are like aligned in terms of goals. And how do you do that? I mean, how did the powers that be produce a certain kind of alignment in their politically animated base? Like they control the education system. So to get people in alignment, you need a shared philosophy. But like, how do you get to that shared philosophy? You can also have a religion, but how do you get to that shared religious vision? I don't have faith in any existing religious organization to
Hmm.
afford the kind of communities I'm talking about. I think basically all of them have been corrupted at multiple levels, and in Western societies. So a new organization will be necessary for that reason, but also metaphysically, philosophically, I don't agree with the tenets of any existing denomination. I think we have a shot at like I said, not like creating a network of new or a set of new dogmas for a new religion, but having a philosophical kind of religion. And the way to organize that is not through like we believe in this set of dogmas, but we participate in this particular kind of educational institution or paradigm. So I like devised my ideas for how that should operate kind of at a large scale optimally, and it would involve all different intellectual disciplines. And I do have a video where I outline it, the Peer Academy model on my channel. It's probably 2 years old now or so. It's relatively short, but I'm not necessarily going to describe that. That is something that I think could be viable as far as like what to do politically in the face of what I believe is coming. And um, the Platonic Academy stuff is just like realistically, given my resources, given what I have expertise in, what I can myself do in the way of teaching, I can run a Platonic school, and that itself would be really valuable. And it's a necessary kind of first step because you can't have a kind of peer um, peer-to-peer networked interdisciplinary model bootstrapped from nothing. Also, I've just been disappointed time and time again trying to run different uh, projects along these lines online. Like I've tried, people have said like, why does it need to be a physical community? Why can't you just run Pure Academy online? Well, I've tried. I've done websites. I've done forums. We have done these projects. The basic idea is kind of a weighted voting system, and people give like independent presentations. So you have a topic like we have had before, or even no topic, and like you just give your presentation. People vote on it, and you weight the votes based on the votes that people themselves received. So the people who are estimated to have done a better job, their votes are calculated and weighed more highly. So it's not, just purely democratic. And then you have like leadership identified and certain rules for how they can change the rules going forward. That's kind of the essence of the idea. And we have implemented it and run a few different projects along those lines, and it's always the same. People just flake out and stop contributing, and at the end, it's just like it always boils down to me and a couple other guys like teaching and having conversations. And okay, fine. Like I will concede to human nature and say like you aren't ready for Peer Academy. You can't do it. So I have to start with the basics. And Plato is the basics. If you want to understand
Mhm.
Western philosophy and get aligned here, like okay, fine. I'll just be the teacher. I will teach you guys Plato. Is that what you want? Like fine. That's my Platonic Academy vision. It's my begrudged like concession to the way people are and the amount of work ethic people have. And I'm just trying to make it work like at minimal cost and so that I can offer it, to myself and to others, so that as many people can participate in it as possible. That's the idea.
Yeah, yeah, I agree that these communities have to transcend like online communities. I think part of that is especially because while you may have people like you talk to online, I don't mean you, I just mean like in general people. Um, you know, it is a you get a it's like a false sense of community. Yes, there is a community there, but it's not a concrete community. It's just sort of like a to use like that term, like Jean Valjean, it's like a simulacrum, a simulation rather, of a community. It's not like a real thing. So I think it's important to have like a real concrete community. I think also uh, this whole like you could very clearly see uh, that the attempt at atomization of individuals is a very real thing just by the nature of like looking at like suburbs, like the way they're designed
Mm-hmm.
architecturally. I think because I spent some time in Europe and in some of those older villages, and you see like the houses themselves are all like I don't want to say cramped, but they're just closer to each other, like a real community.
Right.
In America, because it's sort of it's a newer nation. There's more of these sort of like spread out communities, like and a lot of people don't even know who their neighbors are a lot of the time today. So I
Hmm.
think I think also like that's something that a lot of people don't consider is that like the actual very structure of the way we live, like physically, is uh is designed in a way to keep you atomized, which is unfortunate, but I think that's true.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Uh, and yeah, I mean that's pretty much all the questions I had for you. If there's anything else you wanted to talk about or add, I'm happy to hear that. If that's all you had for today, that's fine with me.
Um, Not in particular. Yeah, I didn't see your response to the nationalist video right away. I saw it once you messaged me, then I looked at your channel and I saw it.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I don't think it was that complex a disagreement that I ultimately had with your response. I don't remember entirely the nature of the response, but basically I mean, to like maybe point to a future discussion if you want to talk again, we could get into
Yes.
that where how do you justify and ground the ethical norm of ethno-nationalism, because it does deprive a lot of people of a lot of liberty. You're taking choices away from people. You're saying to a lot of people, you can't do this. You can't live the way you want to live. And unless you have a really strong moral argument that is going to convince everybody, you can only do that through force. And if you want to do that through force, again, are you that sure in this moral foundation that like tells you this is the way to go? Because I do believe there is a natural tendency for ethnic types to have solidarity within themselves. Also, that like basically communities operate more efficiently when they are homogenous. But I also think that, there has been a cosmopolitan type throughout the ages that lived in multicultural, predominantly educational contexts, like an ashram in India or like the universities, like the Platonic universities in antiquity. And the cosmopolitan, you're not going to stop cosmopolitans from being what they are and doing what they're going to do. And like it or not, they are running the show, they are running history. It's not like just ethnocentric, you know who's that
Yeah.
are running the show. It's a cosmopolitan international type, and that kind of points to the validity and power that this kind of strategy gives you. So, like for the average person, ethnic solidarity is generally going to be healthier, etc. But not for everybody. For a certain set of people, they can achieve far more intellectually and in terms of political power if they associate it with a kind of high IQ nationalism of just the people that, and you're not going to stop that. You can't tell the high agency, high IQ people of all the various nations of the world not to collude to gain power. Like you have to have that globalist side of things addressed in your political theory. But moreover, like I think in general, there's a naturalistic fallacy where people have some arguments or some idea that like ethnic solidarity is generally healthy and therefore like
Yeah.
the state should mandate it. And it's like, okay, not good enough. If you're right and people have these natural tendencies, then just plain old libertarianism solves it because guess what? People can go ahead and associate in whatever way they want, ethnically or not. So that's, I think that no nationalist that I've seen, and I've been in these circles since 2012, 2011. I've seen the rise and fall of various movements, and nobody has like airtight arguments actually that would warrant like I'm going to take a gun and tell you you have to live the way I'm telling you to live. And
Right.
furthermore, you don't have like the power or authority to make that call. So like, what are you even doing talking about it in the first place? You might as well focus on what you can do rather than something that you can't do. And even if you could do it, I don't know that anyone has the moral justification to like actually support doing it.
Yes. No, I agree with you that there needs to be rigor. By that I mean there needs to be like actual argumentation, and I'm definitely not a proponent of I hope I didn't do this in the video. I have It's been a long time since I remember what I said, but I don't if I did say this, I'll correct myself now. I don't support the idea of basically it is natural therefore good. Not no way whatsoever. I mean, not flossing your teeth is natural. Doesn't make it good. Um,
Hmm.
and well, I agree with you. There needs to be, and I think we definitely should have like a full discussion dedicated to this. I've definitely wanted to do that. And if you're, yeah, so we could definitely set that up. But just to kind of allude to it, I agree for the most part with that. I do also agree with you made a video just like trying to make an important distinction between ethno nationalism and ethnocentrism. Like
Hmm.
those aren't the same thing because you can be an ethnocentrist but not attached to a certain uh, plot of land or a certain geographic area. Yeah, I agree with that. That's fine. Um, and I mean, yeah. So I think I would be happy to present a moral argument. I think what we could do is I would be happy to like kind of set up a conversation where maybe I'd probably want to write out a concise moral argument, put some rigor into it, and then present it to you, and then you could critique it. I would love to hear that. So I think I'd definitely be interested in setting that up.
Okay. Yep. Sounds. I will say, like up front though, the problem, any proposed argument is going to be dubitable,
Of
right?
course.
Unless you invent like from metaphysics up and absolutely, demonstrable, like irrefutable position, then I guess I'd be compelled logically to agree with you. But if there's any room for doubt at all, then I think it's like a strategy where you encourage a multitude of different polities to explore. It's kind of that quantum computing thing. Like God gave us freedom to explore different ways of life so that he would know what lies down all of those options because we simply don't know. Like we conjecture, we heuristically simplify, we say this is how it is, but at every step where we simplify, we're not telling the entire truth. Like reality is always more complex, and so, like, no, I don't think any political theory can dictate this is the way polities should be. I think there should be a variety of polities that are allowed to exist, but it's not like it's up to us to allow it or not. They are allowed to exist if they have the power to exist. Like at a certain level, the globe is like ruled by anarchy. There anarchy at a
Uh-huh.
global level, and anything that crops up within that has the power to support itself or it doesn't. And so in a way, we don't even have like a real option to say this is how polities should be and will be unless like you become the global dictator and and tell everyone else the only way to do things. But then like if you did that, I would say that's a dystopic world because whatever your ideas are, you're not God, you're not omniscient, and so you should allow the exploration of alternative viewpoints, worldviews, etc. So like you can come up with an argument, but unless it's indubitable and absolutely certain, I would still say like, yeah, good, nice argument, but let's see if it actually pans out in practice. Meaning, let's not prohibit other forms of political association. So we can leave it
Yeah.
at that. And
Okay. Okay. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today. I had a great conversation. Hope you did as well. And yeah, I'm gonna upload this and then I'll leave a link to your channel in the description. So
okay, sounds good. You just go by Gabriel or
yeah, Gabriel's fine. You can just
okay.
call. Yeah.
Yeah, it was nice speaking with you, Gabriel. Take care.
Thank you. You too.